Anna Kvit is a visiting research fellow at University College London. Her research focuses on women in the military of Ukraine, veterans' reintegration into civilian life, and the gendered impacts of the war in Ukraine. Anna contributed to the development of programs and policies on the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Ukraine. She co-taught military sociology at the National University of the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Anna holds degrees from both the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the University of Kassel in Germany. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you enjoy the material we create, then please do like and subscribe. It will help other people to discover the fantastic guests that we feature. And do, of course, please consider becoming a patron to support the work of the channel. Anna, I'm really delighted to welcome you. And this isn't a topic we've covered yet on the channel.
Good afternoon, Jonathan. Thank you very much for inviting me to your podcast.
Now, I should say normally you're based in London, actually, for your research, but at the moment you are in Kiev. So please, if the internet goes down or there's a break in the recording, just to explain to the audience there that that's why that might be. Well, let's jump into the subject, because this is a very dynamic topic, isn't it? And the scale of women volunteers in the army has really changed. Prior to actually 2014, it's changed obviously with the with that invasion of Crimea and the 8-year period for the full-scale war. But it's also accelerated as well, hasn't it, since February last year?
Yes, absolutely. The number of women in the armed forces of Ukraine has increased since last year. A lot. Women in the military in Ukraine seems to be a very new topic and unusual. But technically, women were in the armed forces of Ukraine before this war started in 2013 and before it escalated last year. But the reasons for women to be in the military were different back then. And now, of course, in 2014, after the occupation of Crimea and invasion of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine, women volunteered to join the armed forces of Ukraine to defend Ukraine. Protection was the main motivation, but not only. Some of them had personal motivations, more personal than just than the general motivation to protect and fight back the aggression. And so it was the first wave, 2014 and 2015, and then another wave of women actively volunteering to join armed forces of Ukraine was in February and March 2022, after the full-scale invasion, of course. And over this almost 10 years, we have, I think, almost 5 times more women officers in the armed forces of Ukraine, and 2 and 5 times more women in the military service. But if we talk about the numbers, at the moment, according to the recent data, to the latest data, there are 60,000 of women in the armed forces of Ukraine, and 42,000 of women are women on the military service. And if what it tells us is it a lot or not, so yes, it is. It's more than in any other European army, even such large armies as French or Italian or UK armies. I cannot tell you what is the ratio of women and men at the moment, but before the invasion, we had approximately 17% of women in the military service and more than 20% women in general, which is also way higher than, for example, average in the NATO armies.
And it must take time, though, for women to rise up the ranks, and it must depend on there being a large number of women in the lower ranks coming at the bottom. It must take years, if not decades, for them to reach the upper levels of the military structure. So when you say they're officers, are we talking here about sort of junior officer level, or are we seeing more women go up into the sort of mid and higher positions?
It's a very good question. It does take a lot of time indeed, and there are obstacles. There were obstacles to that because not all military education was available for women some years ago. So at the moment, we have women starting from the lowest positions mainly, and then growing their career. We do not have, almost don't have women in the highest decision-making level positions at the moment. But I hope that with having all the education, military education, open for women a few years ago, I hope that, and with their current military service experience, I hope that it will change with years.
Is it also important, and I was going to come to this at the end, but it seems sort of appropriate to tackle it now. There is a similar process, isn't there, of women in politics being far more active, certainly since the Revolution of Dignity, but also now with so many men on the front, women are really fulfilling that sort of civil society role. A lot more are entering into politics. Is it important that there are more women in politics to then also drive change in attitudes and promotions within the military?
I don't know the results of I don't know if they checked it statistically, but in general, yes, it is important because having more women in decision making affects the decisions that are taken. This is the proven fact. At the moment in Ukraine, we have 20% of women deputies in the parliament. This is the highest percentage we ever had. And yes, women are very active in politics nowadays, and they are extremely active in civil society. And their activity, their work is they make a great input to the resistance and defense force and to keeping the society going in these hard times. And I must say that yes, having women, active women, also supports promotion of integration of women into the military sector as well.
And at what point, though, did women start taking up combat roles? Because, of course, at the moment, there are women now on the front. We'll come to political prisoners in a minute, or military prisoners, rather, because there are women who are being put on trial at the moment as part of the Azov defenders. But at what point and how much resistance was there to women coming into frontline combat roles?
There was a certain resistance. First of all, at the beginning of this war, it was not possible from a legal point of view. And also, there was a resistance from the society, from the military man as well, because combat roles are not traditional women's roles. And because of different reasons, they were not welcomed there by some people, not by everybody, but some would say that it's very dangerous. Others would say that it's very physically exhausting. So there were obstacles, but with the beginning of the war, women joined also volunteer battalions, which within a year were integrated in the structures of defense and security. But in volunteer battalions, they occupied, some of them, they performed combat roles. And it was already the big argument to prove that women actually can do this, and they are doing it, and they are effective. So it was a starting point to advocate for opening combat positions for women in Ukraine.
And you talk there about the nature of the risks changing as women moved from some support roles into combat roles. But even in support roles, there's a certain level of risk, isn't there? So if you're in, sort of medic roles and you're on the front line, you're still exposed to some extreme dangers. You're still exposed to experiencing things that will induce physical and even mental trauma. But how do you think the risks have changed as this move into combat roles came in? And what is the nature of the risks that women are now taking?
Well, Ukraine is in war, so I think that the risks are very high and very obvious. And this division of into support roles and combat roles. Maybe it, well, maybe in the context, in the peaceful context, it would have different meaning. But being in the state of an active war, people who are occupying the so-called support roles, they are not sitting in the offices in Kyiv. They are, many of them are on the front line. So it is also dangerous. And if we talk about, so it's dangerous for their life and their health. And also talking about women, you saw what the Russian army is doing to women in the occupied territories. And from what I read in the interviews with people who were in captivity, military women are also exposed to the risks of conflict-related sexual violence.
And there's a well-known story which I think you've commented on, which is of the combat medic who was captured in prison for 3 months, Yulia Payeska. So what can we tell from those sort of personal testimonies of people who've actually been captured, held by the Russians? What do we learn about their conditions and experience?
We can learn that their rights are not respected, and this is the softest way how I can put this. If you look at the exchange of prisoners of war, Ukrainian prisoners of war who come back from Russian captivity, they are in critical conditions often, and they got into this condition in the captivity. We know that they are being tortured, that they don't have enough of food, they don't have any healthcare services. They are being psychologically pressured. We also know that cases of conflict-related sexual violence are also happening there, but unfortunately there are not many statistical data or statements from survivors, but this is very typical for this type of crime. It is rarely reported. It is very underreported crime, and people start talking about it years after the events happen. And
looking at what's going on at the moment, so these Azov defenders, I think they, I may be wrong here, but I think they're from the Azovstal sort of resistance there. They're actually being put on trial, I think, in Moscow at this point, and there are women amongst those defenders. It is, of course, against the Geneva Convention, so this, in essence, is a war crime. Are the experiences of people who've been in Russian captivity and then exchanged, are their experiences all being documented? And in what level of detail does that have to happen in order for that evidence to be used in future war crimes tribunals?
There are special protocols how to record the statements of people who survived, whose rights were violated, who survived this, who come back from captivity as well. And yes, their statements are being recorded. Unfortunately, I don't work in the prosecutor's office. I cannot tell him how they do it technically, but I know that it is being done, of course.
Yes, and that's run by the government. I mean, there are a lot of private organizations also gathering people's testimony, especially amongst civilians. But in case of the military personnel, is that primarily being done by the government?
Yes, and if we talk about conflict-related sexual violence, it is also done by civil society organizations may do this, but it is important that the government does it. And government is doing this, of course.
And another government initiative, which I think is quite an interesting one that you've mentioned in your article, and we will put links to that article in the description of this video so people can find it, but the National Defenders Day was renamed in 2021. Is this a strong signal that attitudes are changing and that women combatants and women veterans are now hopefully being considered at the same level as their male colleagues, or is there still some way to go in changing these attitudes?
Yeah, it was several years ago, they did change the name of the National Defenders Day to the National Day of Women and Men Defenders. And it's a, well, it's a, it is a very important signal, let's say, from the perspective of how we present our armed forces of Ukraine, how we represent our army, who are those who defend us during the war, and they highlight that there are women there, and they, except for the name of the day, and they also, the government, the Military of Defense, or the Ministry of Defense, for example, they use images of women also in the military to portray how our army looks like. So these are female and male faces, of course, and the attitude towards women is in the army is changing. Talking about the day of men and women defenders, over the last year, I've heard many people talking that we should pray about boys and girls who are defending us, and it's not part of the research, but I hear it in a daily life, in a conversation with people I know. So it's already the recognized fact. But if we talk about the numbers and research, so in 2018 there was a survey, all national survey of adult population of Ukraine, and one of the questions was if you think that women and men should have equal rights in the armed forces of Ukraine, and 53% of respondents said that yes. And it was already 5th year of the war, but still only half of people thought that they should have equal rights. Last year, they asked the same question, and 80% of people said that yes, we think that women and men should have equal rights. And I think it's a very good change because women are being seen and recognized in the military. Yes, but on the other hand, I cannot, from these results and from these changes, we hardly can say something about what is waiting for us in future. Because during the war, during the full-scale war, when our lives are in danger, for example, today we already had an attack, we already had to hide in a bomb shelter. And it's like this every day. So having people who are defending you, you feel gratitude and you respect them. Although experience of other countries after the war shows that women are asked to come back to more traditional women's roles after the war. If this will be the case of Ukraine, in Ukraine, I cannot say. We often discuss it with my colleagues, and we think that it won't be possible to just to forget this experience. I don't think that there will be a major rollback, because we already have lots of laws changed that are supportive towards integrating women into the military sector. Integrating women into the military sector is part of the national development agenda and national international commitments. We have a national action plan on implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which also focuses, part of it focuses on women in the military. And also we have women who have this military experience, and we have women who want to develop their career in the military sector. Yes, and we have many citizens of Ukraine who are recognizing women in the military, and I hope are grateful to them. So I think that these changes that we're seeing now will remain.
And of course, you spoke of some examples from history, and of course, two big ones would be Britain after the First and Second World War, and during those wars, women played much bigger roles in wartime than they did in peacetime. In the First World War, working in armaments factories and so on, and then in the Second World War, driving buses, doing jobs that were traditionally the preserve of men. And then straight after the war, there was a reversion, almost back to attitudes. Well, there was obviously social change and so on, but in terms of gender roles in the workplace, there was a big regression. But at that point, there were very few women in politics. So do you think that's the big change here, is that there's so many more women involved in political decision making, in parliament and civil society, and of course journalism? Go back to Second World War, post-war Britain, there were relatively few women in journalism at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. The society after the First World War, after the Second World War, and the modern society are very different ones. Even if we look at the gender rights and women's rights and recognition of the importance of gender equality and promotion of women's rights. So, and also because there are more women in the decision-making level, at the national decision-making level, and in civil society and in media, yes. And actually the whole process of promoting women's rights in the defense sector was a joint effort of different stakeholders, civil society and government, and women in the military and veterans. So we already have this experience. And I think that, yes, because of this, because of many different factors, I don't think that the history, like example of First World War or Second World War, will repeat. I hope not.
And of course, if we go back, a couple of decades, Ukraine, essentially similar to many other countries that have emerged from the Soviet sphere, quite a patriarchal society traditionally, but now we see extremely strong female characters in a whole range, and especially if we consider the recent awarding of the Nobel Prize for the Center of Civic Liberties. So incredibly strong sort of female figureheads in academia and so on. Are paternal or paternalistic values being challenged, right across society? Even let's say who performs what role in the home, cooking, washing up, doing that kind of stuff. I'm going to say this having, had some interesting discussions with, because I live in Oxford, and then we have lots and lots of refugee families here, and quite lively discussions because they're living in local families, and they're observing what the husbands do, what the women do, and then debating it. So how do you feel this is all going to play out, if you take into consideration traditional paternal values?
I think they will change, but because of very different factors. Because, for example, now we have millions of women with children living outside of Ukraine, learning to perform all the roles. Unfortunately, they have to perform female and male roles because they have to take care of their family, and they are the only one adult in the family at the moment. And the same we can say about men who are staying in Ukraine, because if their family left, now they have to perform the male role, but they have to take care of themselves and cook food and clean and do everything and communicate with relatives who are left here, which is also very usually women's responsibility to maintain these networks with family and friends. Sorry, about the roles, but the complicated part here is that sometimes I hear from Western maybe journalists as well, that if women go to the war to prove that they have a right to do it, and it's not their motivation at all. And in fact, many women who are at war, they maybe don't even consider themselves to be feminists. They are not living within this division, feminist, not feminist. And I know some of them are public figures. They have very traditional views about the gender roles, and them being in the military does not mean anything for them. It doesn't change them in their opinion as a woman and their expectation from men. So it's a more complicated reality, which is very interesting. And as a researcher, I could say that it's worth researching. But yes, I think that because of many different factors, because of the new experience, because we have media and we have government who highlights it again and again about the gender equality, and because people are living these experiences now, suddenly they had to do this. They had to try different gender roles because of the critical situation we're living in now.
And has your research uncovered some of these motivations, or is this an area for future research? Because, reading articles, doing interviews with people, you get a sense of a huge range of different reasons. And obviously the sense of just wanting to survive and protect your country and your family and your land, that's quite an obvious one. But there are other people who've actually lost husbands, children, parents. This can also be a motivation in some cases to join the military.
Yes, in some cases, this is what I mentioned at the beginning, that some women who join the military, they have very personal reasons. Some of them can be following a family member or a partner. They go to the war together, but some of them can join the military after losing a family member because of this war, or family members. Yes, this is what I know, but also if we look at what was happening at the occupied territories and what is still happening, we don't know about these territories a lot now. Women don't have rights there. Nobody has rights at the occupied territories. Women face extreme risks of conflict-related sexual violence. Their husbands and their male relatives or neighbors, they also face extreme risks for their life and health. And if we look at the occupied territories that were occupied since 2014, I cannot say there were human rights or women's rights, or there was an opportunity to defend their rights. So basically, life under occupation, if you don't fight back the occupation, Russian aggression, you risk to end up under occupation. And being under occupation means having no rights in the best case scenario and no life in the worst case scenario. So this is, I think, one of the big motivations at the moment for many people.
We know that Russian propaganda is intense in those occupied territories. And does this influence, the number of women that sort of sign up? Is it higher in any areas of Ukraine, or is it fairly evenly spread? The numbers of women, the percentage of women that sign up, right across the unoccupied territories.
I cannot tell you at the moment. We don't have this data. It's not available, unfortunately. The data we have is very scarce and very general. It's about the general representation of women in the army. But I'm trying to think about the data we had before. I cannot say that there were more people from the territories adjacent to the occupied territories. They are from all over Ukraine. There were many people from Western Ukraine, but there were also from Eastern Ukraine. So it's not that. I don't think that the being close to the occupied territories is one of the main reasons.
And you mentioned the Ministry of Defence using now very prominently in its sort of recruitment materials and social media posts, using female service people in those images. That of course creates a great impression of equality, but in reality, is that what women are experiencing day to day with their male colleagues, or is there still some work to be done to create, genuine sort of equality on the front line in reality?
I think it's like in the society in general, and probably in every society in general. Women do think in the military that there is still place for improvement. But if you ask, not everybody, but sometimes men would say that women already have all the rights in Ukraine. We don't have problems with gender equality, and something like this can be said towards women in the military. But from my interviews with women in the military, yes, they do voice that many changes have happened, but there is still place for further work.
And we know in the civilian workplace, I mean, this is true in the UK and most societies, that sometimes to get sort of promotions and to get into senior roles, women have to go, the extra mile to prove their capability, to prove their skills and their knowledge, go perhaps further than male colleagues. We know that this can potentially happen in minorities as well. Do you think this is also the case in the military, that to get, as you say, into those higher levels, those leadership levels, you have to really strive that little bit harder as a woman?
Women in the military, yes, they say this, that well, some of them voice that they have difficulties with professional development within the military, that growing professionally, I mean, in the ranks, sometimes is complicated for them, most likely because they are women.
And we also see that in some cases, you will have both partners in the military. I mean, what I think it's probably a fairly obvious answer, but what kind of challenges does it create when you have both, the male and the female of a family unit in the military? And sometimes they may even have children, which would then need to be looked after. Do we know whether this is quite sort of prevalent, or is this quite an unusual sort of circumstance?
Well, there are families like this. There are people like this, of course, and child care in the family of military, in the military family, is from the policy perspective and from the perspective of reality, is a bit complicated thing, and until recently, if the reality was that if both spouses or partners are in the military and they have a child, then woman would spend more time with the child, and man would continue his career. To some extent, if we look at the policies only, it was probably linked to the fact that in case they have a child, only woman could take a maternity leave. Father in the military couldn't take paternity leave, but it has been changed 2 years ago, 2 years or 1 year ago, I don't remember. I think 2 years ago, in the end of 2021. And now, if men and women are both, if two partners are in the military and they have a child, then they can choose who will take care of the child, which is a very big change for.
You've also written extensively, I know this is a developing area of research, about the rehabilitation of service people. And of course, we know that many people are already coming back with physical traumas. And it would be interesting to sort of hear, what needs to be done more to support them. But also, there are going to be a lot of people coming back with mental health problems, mental trauma. And, I expect that will be experienced by both men and women equally. This is an area which still needs a lot of work, isn't it, to create that infrastructure to support people with mental health issues?
Yes, it needs a lot of effort and infrastructure, but also we have Ministry of Veteran Affairs, we have Veteran Fund, we have civil society organizations. We have, I think, some international organizations working in this area. The work started not this year, it started in 2015, I think. But the number of veterans back at that time, and number of veterans now, and number of veterans that we will have will be different. So yes, it's a growing and constantly developing area, and again, a lot of resources and a lot of effort is required to provide this assistance and to establish this system in order that it's functional in a way that it's helpful. Because it's a rather new reality for Ukraine and for Ukrainians and for Ukrainian institutions and people, because this is we didn't have it. It's the war started in 2014, but before that we were living in a peaceful society.
And there probably isn't a historical precedent for the number of active female service personnel who are going to be coming back with both physical and especially mental trauma. That, to an extent, is not an experience other countries would have had to go through. Even somewhere like Israel, where you have a lot of females in the military, they're not dealing with this sort of scale of casualties that we're going to see here and the scale of trauma. Do you think that, and this might, be quite an ill-informed question, but are women going to have the same challenges as men, or are men perhaps more at risk from, say, post-traumatic stress disorder because they're perhaps maybe less likely to discuss mental health problems? There's maybe more of a taboo around discussing it, whereas women potentially can be more communicative or have a richer network of contacts. Or do you think that's too simplistic a way of looking at the problem?
I think that this is very complicated. It is difficult to predict who will have more severe consequences of being at war and being in the military during the wartime. Well, at the moment, we don't know the severity of the consequences. For example, depends on the role in the military, and there probably we have more men. It's because we have more men in the army, and so more men will be coming back from. There will be more men with physical and psychological consequences of participating of fighting at war, but. And also men tend to speak less about their experience, about how they this military transition from military to civilian life. But from our previous experience before 2022, it was not easy for women as well, but because of different reasons. First of all, a female veteran in the society is a very new role and very unusual. So not everybody would recognize this woman and her status. They would have a more suspicious attitude towards her. Why you were fighting? Did you do this? Is it true? Why did you do that? We didn't ask you to do that, or things like this, which is very, very rude and very, very awful, actually. I think it will change now, this kind of attitudes from some people in the society, but also because there are less women than men veterans, they have more challenges with finding the community for them. For example, before, and many of them don't live in the big cities where the services for veterans are available. So basically, it will be one woman in one village, one woman in another town, in another city, and and Ukraine is a very big country. So when they come back to their hometowns, it is very difficult to maintain this communication in person. And another challenge with reintegration. There are lots of challenges, but just those that are on surface, that are very obvious, and that or some of those that we researched, is that when coming back from war, it's related again to the attitudes. Women are more expected to be women. Yes, they had this military experience, they were at war. Their family and their community may be grateful to them. They recognize it, they understand this. But also they know that now it's time to take care of their children or get married and take care of their husband. And these expectations from women, veterans, as from women, they don't disappear. Whereas from men, there are not that many expectations related to taking care of a family in an emotional way, for example. He doesn't have to be perfect father again, because everybody understands that he was at war and he saw horrible things and he survived and experienced horrible things. Whereas women tend to say that they feel this pressure from the society to be normal civilian women again.
And of course, if you take something like, it could be Vietnam, Korean War, even the Second World War, returning men are returning to a civilian society. We know that civilian society tends to have a less of an understanding of what war is. It can even be more, nationalistic, whereas people coming back from war tend to, not want to boast about it or even talk about it that much. But here you've got this unique situation where there will be a huge quantity of women. There'll be a lot of people who will have come under bombardment. So amongst the population in general, there'll be a much acuter understanding of what war means and less glorification of it. I mean, do you think in some ways that's going to help in the post-war environment?
To be honest, this is a very complicated question because I am part of this, and everybody has experience of war in Ukraine, but not everybody's experience. Well, people have very different experience of war, and I am afraid that on the one hand, probably yes, we do understand this reality and it unites us, but on the other hand, I think that there may be a division between those who lost family members and those who didn't, those who were in the occupation, those who were not, those who left and those who stayed, and those who were fighting and those who were not fighting. And at the moment, I cannot say how it will be after the end of the war.
And there's a lot of change that's going to happen. I mean, this is pretty much sort of the last era of questioning. There's going to have to be a lot of change and adaptation, isn't there? Both in legislation to support, as you said, the support for people with traumas. Mobility access is going to have to change because I understand that in many cities there is minimal access there. But another really significant pressure is that, in interviewing people who've been on the front line and seeing lots of sort of video footage, I can see that Russian and Ukrainian are sort of interchangeable as languages. And, for a point of practicality, you can hear both sort of going on all the time. But there is a lot of pressure now, isn't there, for people to, and quite understandable pressure for people to really start, improving their Ukrainian language and to use much more Ukrainian language in civil society. Do you think this is going to place additional pressure on both female and male veterans returning from the front, all these sort of social changes that are going on?
I don't think that the language will be a pressure. Ukrainians are bilingual, and everybody speaks, well, everybody understands, definitely understands Ukrainian. Maybe some people don't have much practice with Ukrainian, but many people are shifting to Ukrainian, even though sometimes they say it's psychologically difficult when you're a 60-year-old woman and you feel that you might, well, it's unusual for some people, but it's amazing how they do this. Everybody in Ukraine speaks Ukrainian and understands Ukrainian. They may feel that they haven't used it with family for a while, but I don't think it will be a pressure, and also there is this level of respect and trust and recognition of people who are fighting at war and veterans. Yeah, I don't think they will be impressed with the language after this.
And my last question is the legislature, is the government, the parliament keeping up with the changes to legislation and laws required to support veterans? Or is there still a lot of work that needs to be done, on that sort of legal and governmental level?
I think they are keeping up as much as they can. Honestly, there's always something can be done additionally, but they are changing. The government works during the war, and the Ministry of Veteran Affairs also works. Obviously, that everybody works under extreme pressure and lack of resources, human resources including, but they are changing, they are adapting to the new challenges, and I believe that they will continue doing so.
Well, Anna, your research is absolutely fascinating. I know you've got sort of years of material to research after this war finishes, and hopefully that is sooner. But yeah, I'll read your articles with great interest, and I know the audience would appreciate your insights as well. So all I've got to say is thank you so much. Slava Ukraini.
Heroям slava. Thank you for inviting me. I hope your audience will enjoy this video.